This time it's 5 stunning V4 motorcycles. The V4 engine. It's often associated, today at least, with Hondas of the 1980s and of course modern Ducati Grand Prix races. But it's been around a lot longer than that. And so here are 5 stunning V4 production road bikes. The Matchless Silver Hawk. Associated Motorcycles were early pioneers of the V4 engine layout, producing a design in the early 30s with an overhead cam which didn't really reach full production. They would go on to design the narrow angle V4 for the Silver Hawk. This engine did reach production, and perhaps even more famously there was their V4 water-cooled Grand Prix racer, which despite its stunning specification failed to achieve the hoped for success at the 1939 TT. But what about the Silver Hawk? Well, the Silver Hawk arrived in 1931 and was of a stunningly modern specification. Overhead cam, a narrow angle V4 of 600cc, or 592cc to be exact. The bike had a bore and stroke of 50.8 by 73. However, designed for touring, the bike was in a modest state of tune, so top speed was only around 80 miles an hour. The machine was designed by Bert Collier and was developed from the earlier Silver Arrow, which used a 400cc side valve narrow angle V-twin engine. The Silver Hawk engine was quite different, however. The angle was opened out to 26 degrees and the side valves were replaced with a bevel driven single overhead cam with rocker arms to operate the coil spring poppet valves. This impressive machine arrived about the same time as Ariel's Square 4 and did suffer some of the same cooling problems, and the overhead cam would prove problematic also. But in many ways the V4 was superior in design to the Ariel, having a more effective inlet tract and also featuring a rear suspension system. But unfortunately, in a time of great austerity, the advanced V4 was too expensive to produce and sold in too modest numbers, and ultimately the bike would be deleted from the range in 1935 after just 4 years of modest sales. The Honda VFR 750. In the early 80s, Honda decided that the V4 was the way to go. After all, they reasoned, everybody was building a crosser frame 4s by this point, so let's do something different. And so they created the V4 range, originally as a 400, a 750 and a 1000, with a 500 following later. But all was not well. There were cam chain problems, and worst of all supply to the top end was insufficient, so the camshafts wore very rapidly, a problem which is much worse on the larger engines. And to cap it off, the whole bike was complex, heavy and expensive. But the design overall did seem very futuristic. But unfortunately for Honda, it wasn't long before those early top end problems began to show. Honda did move to redesign the engine to cure most of the problems, but in sales terms the damage was done, leaving Honda with a major financial headache. But this is Honda after all, and they have resources. And so 1986 would see the arrival of the all-new VFR range. And these machines represented a complete redesign of the V4 format. There was now just a 400 and 750cc motorcycles, in most markets at least, and the engine was completely different. Although it was still a V4, it now used gear-driven cams, so no more cam chain problems, with an improved lubrication system of course, and even the firing order was different. And better still, even though the new bike was more complex, largely thanks to the aluminium chassis, it was actually lighter than the previous model, and was more powerful of course. And then there was the full fairing, replacing the half fairing from the original bikes. The new VFR ran an engine of 748cc with a bore and stroke of 70 by 48.6. Compression ratio was 11:1. Honda would claim performance to be 105 horsepower and around 145 miles an hour top speed. The bike weighed in at 226 kilos or 498 pounds wet weight, and fuel capacity in later models like the one shown here was 21 litres. Handy because while the bike had many great virtues, good fuel economy was never one of them. The VFR is perhaps one of Honda's true classics, and was described as much on its first appearance. And while the bike was never quite the sales success that Honda had hoped for, it was nevertheless a solid seller throughout its production run, which would run through with some modifications from 1986 all the way until 1997. Now there were of course production racer V4s, these being the RVF, the RC30 and the RC45. All these machines are eye-wateringly expensive and very rare. So if you want a race replica and it must be a V4, 400s are the way to go. Much more common and importantly much less expensive to buy. Nevertheless, these bikes have the same dual-like precision of the larger V4s. I would make a brilliant choice for a first sports bike, as long as you're not too tall of course. The Honda Pan-European. The intended market for this bike is a dead giveaway, it's in the name after all. And while the Goldwing was always built with the American market in mind, the Pan-European was designed specifically for the European market. And while I don't normally like to include more than one machine from any particular company, I feel the Pan-European is so different from the VFR that it's worth a mention in its own right. The first Pan-European, the ST1100, arrived in 1990 and was an instant favourite with police forces pretty much all over the world. With its inline mounted crankshaft and shaft drive, the Pan differed greatly from the VFR. The engine was a water-cooled single overhead cam unit of 1085 cc's with a bore and stroke of 73 by 64.8. Claim peak power was fairly modest 100 horsepower at just 8,500 rpm. Torque however was prodigious and produced throughout the rev range. Like the Goldwing however, the bike was pretty heavy, weighing in at 288 kilos or 635 pounds. But fortunately the V4 engine meant that the weight was carried very low and the bike is surprisingly manageable and very easy to move at low speeds. One of the key reasons for its popularity amongst police forces. That and its incredible reliability, these bikes are extremely tough and if well maintained can run up very high mileages. The seat height of the original model is quoted at just 800mm, but the seat is also rather wide, so if you're a shorter rider you might want to try the bike out first. And this is very much a motorcycle of its period. It's very long and it's very large physically. So not surprisingly the machine doesn't have the nimbleness of the little VFR 400. That being said, if you try and chase one of these things down, speaking from experience, they corner very stably and can really crack on with a good rider aboard. In 2002 the bike was replaced by the ST1300. Although the machines are basically similar, the chassis are quite different and the bodywork and look is very different too. The Yamaha VMAX. For me, the VMAX timeline has always ran something like this. Honda released the 750 Magna, their first V4 cruiser in 1982, and the engineering team at Yamaha looked at each other and said, challenge accepted. And basically what they did is the same as Kawasaki had achieved just a few years earlier with the Z1. Take what Honda had done first, and then one-up it in the biggest way possible. The first generation VMAX arrived in 1985 and used a 1197cc liquid-cooled dual overhead cam 70-degree V4 engine with a bore and stroke of 76 by 66. Yamaha would claim 120 horsepower and 150 miles an hour. And while the bike does fall slightly short of these figures, it is nevertheless an extremely impressive machine for the period. And this was truly a machine of extremes. Big weight, big power, all wrapped up in a crazy power cruiser aesthetic. The riding position was more suited to a traditional Harley type cruiser, so with this kind of power you were hanging on for dear life. The machine was the epitome of the 80s muscle bike. Lots of power, but also lots of weight and a chassis that can barely cope. But for the riders who love the things, that's all just part of the fun. The bike weighed in at a fairly impressive 631 pounds or 286 kilos wet. Although handily, for those of shorter stature, the seat height was just 765mm. And when you're dealing with a bike of this stature, that can only be a good thing. And you have to say that the VMAX created a class of motorcycle all of its own, and one which a number of bikes would follow today, including the ludicrous Triumph Rocket 3. But for fans of the VMAX, the bike was first in class and remains the best. But apart from that massive V4 engine, perhaps the bike's most famous feature is the V-Boost system, which was only fitted in certain markets. This system automatically controls a butterfly which is placed between two of the carburetors. And when the bike hit 5,750 rpm, the valve opened, effectively feeding each cylinder with two carburetors, greatly improving top-end horsepower, especially above 8,000 rpm when both valves were fully opened. And in fact, Yamaha would claim a 10% increase in peak horsepower when the system was fitted. The original VMAX would instantly become a cult classic and would remain in production for a number of years. A reworked version would arrive in 2008 with a completely new 1679cc engine with a slightly narrowed V-angle. This new machine was rather more refined and basic design, so lacked some of the rawness to the original machine. It was consequently not quite as popular, and production would end in 2020. The Ducati Panigale V4. Undoubtedly it is the most exotic bike on this list, and it's also one of the most eagerly anticipated, with Ducati producing a V4 in MotoGP for several years before finally releasing a Panigale road-going V4 version. Although it should be noted that the bike was not Ducati's first road-going V4. This had been the Desmosedici RRS of 2007 and 2008, but this was a limited production machine and was stomach-churningly expensive. And earlier still there had been the Apollo of 1964, but this had not passed the prototype phase. But after a long wait, in 2018 the bike finally reached production. The engine is a 1103cc V4 of 90 degrees with of course water cooling and 16 valves. And of course there's also the V4R, which is an homologation special running a 998cc engine to allow the machine to compete in World Superbike racing. The bigger engine runs a bore and stroke of 81 by 53.5 and the smaller an 81 by 48.4 bore and stroke. Compression ratio is 14:1 and claimed peak power is 211 horsepower or 231 horsepower for the R-Spec version. The weight and general specifications vary enormously, although seat height does not vary between models and is a fairly lofty 830mm. 2020 would see the introduction of the Superleggera. This is probably the high-spec road version available, with a limited run of just 500 machines made. The bike is extremely light, weighing in at just 152 kilos or 335 pounds, achieved through the extensive use of carbon fibre on the swinging arm, wheels and sections of frame. Ducati claimed 221 horsepower at 15,250 RPM, although this is said to rise to 233 horsepower at 15,500 RPM once the race-kitted exhaust is fitted. And the price, well, as they do say, if you have to ask, you can't afford it. I didn't ask, because I already know I can't. What other bikes or collections of bikes would you like to see us do a future video on? Maybe you've got a bike we can use for a test ride. Either way, get in touch below. Hope you enjoyed that video. If you did, don't forget to like and subscribe, and of course, thank you very much for watching.